Tony Soprano and John Sacramone live in the gray area between friend and enemy. On paper, they are allies. One runs New Jersey, the other becomes the boss of the New York family. They eat together, share information, make money on joint deals, and pretend that there is a clear line of respect between them. But under the surface, their relationship is full of jealousy, pride, fear, and quiet insults. To understand where they really stood with each other, you have to look at all the small moments where business and ego collide, and how both men respond when the other one steps over the line. From the start, Tony and Johnny meet each other as middlemen. Johnny is Carmine's right hand in New York, while Tony is the man who runs things on the street for his own boss. In those early years, they find common ground. They do business together, joke around, and even share personal things. Johnny tells Tony about his wife, his daughters, and his worries, and Tony feels free enough to make jokes in front of him. There is a sense that they both see themselves as the real workers, the guys who actually make things happen while the old bosses sit back. That shared feeling creates a kind of bond between them. They understand each other in a way their bosses do not. At the same time, there is already a quiet tension. Johnny is part of the big New York structure, the seat of power that has history and prestige. Tony is the suburban boss across the river, someone that New York sometimes sees as a little brother. Tony senses this. Even when Johnny is friendly, you can feel Tony watching for signs that Johnny might be talking down to him. Tony needs to be respected. Johnny, on the other hand, wants to be seen as the calm and reasonable one compared to hotheads like Phil. He plays the part of the diplomat, and that role works well with Tony in the early years. Tony thinks he can talk to Johnny, work things out, and keep New Jersey from being crushed between New York politics. The first big crack in their relationship appears with something that, on the surface, looks small, a joke about Johnny's wife, Ginny. Ralph makes a nasty comment about her weight. At first, nobody thinks much of it, because this world runs on cruel humor. But Johnny hears the joke and feels humiliated. When he goes to Tony and demands that Ralph be killed over the insult, the situation exposes the gap between how Tony and Johnny see the world. For Johnny, it is not really about the joke. It is about respect and pride. He has built an image of himself as a man who would do anything for his family and as someone who cannot be laughed at behind his back. Tony, however, views the joke as part of the usual dark humor of the life. Ralph is a big earner, and killing him over a wisecrack feels insane. In this moment, Tony sees Johnny as dangerous in a new way. Until then, their disagreements were about money and business. Now they are about emotion. Johnny is ready to start a war over a personal slight. Tony talks to him, tries to calm him, and offers half measures like beating Ralph or sending him away. Johnny acts hurt and stubborn, and all the friendliness between them fades. Underneath their calm words, they both understand something important has changed. Tony starts to see Johnny as a man whose ego might one day cost lives on both sides. On Johnny's side, this episode also changes how he views Tony. He thought Tony would do the right thing and prove their friendship by sacrificing Ralph. Instead, Tony protects his own earner and makes excuses. To Johnny, that looks like weakness and selfishness. He starts to question whether Tony really respects him or only pretends to when it is convenient. When Ralph later disappears for unrelated reasons, Tony allows Johnny to believe that the hit was carried out for Ginny. That lie is its own kind of insult. It keeps the peace, but it builds the relationship on sand. Johnny is satisfied on the surface, but the deeper truth is that he and Tony now treat each other like men who might betray each other in the right situation. Money and power only make things worse between them. When Carmine gets sick, Tony and Johnny end up on opposite sides of a quiet power struggle. Johnny wants to cut Carmine out and move up, while Tony wants a better deal for New Jersey. The HUD scam becomes a symbol for all their issues. Carmine demands a huge cut. Johnny cannot afford to lose face, and Tony resents the idea that he should pay tribute like some peasant at the gate. Johnny tries to use his position in New York to squeeze Tony, acting like the superior partner. Tony pushes back because he cannot be seen bending to New York. The more they fight over money, the more their personal views of each other get poisoned. Tony starts to see Johnny as greedy and two-faced, a guy who smiles at dinner but plots behind closed doors. Johnny starts to see Tony as stubborn, petty, and ungrateful, someone who does not appreciate the protection and prestige New York gives his smaller outfit. At the same time, they still need each other. Tony needs New York to stay stable. Johnny needs Tony's cooperation to keep the money flowing. So they keep talking, keep smiling, and keep adding small, invisible cuts to a relationship that once felt like friendship. When Carmine dies and Johnny finally becomes boss, the balance shifts even more. Johnny moves into the role he always thought he deserved. He expects more respect and more money from everyone, including Tony. But becoming boss also makes Johnny more paranoid and more sensitive. He feels that people are judging him, that Phil is watching his every move, that little Carmine is waiting for a chance to come back. In that pressure cooker, Tony stops being a friend and becomes one more potential rival who might exploit any sign of weakness. Tony sees this change very clearly. The man who once acted like a calm friend now acts more like a thin-skinned dictator. Johnny's arrest in his front yard, crying as the agents take him away in front of his family, is another crack in how Tony sees him. Tony had always liked to think of Johnny as a stand-up guy, someone who could keep it together. Seeing him break down when he is arrested changes that image. Tony feels a mix of pity and contempt. On one hand, he understands the pain of being taken away from your family. On the other, he treats Johnny's tears as proof that Johnny is not as strong as he wanted everyone to believe. That kind of private judgment shows that Tony's respect had limits. Even after Johnny is in jail, their relationship continues through phone calls and sit-downs. Johnny still tries to act like the big boss pulling strings from prison. He asks Tony for help, for money, for favors with lawyers. But every time Johnny calls, Tony has to weigh the cost. Helping Johnny means dealing with Phil and with New York's internal drama. There is no real upside for Tony except keeping the peace. So Tony plays along, but his heart is not in it. He gives just enough to avoid open war, while looking for chances to keep New York from leaning too hard on him. One of the clearest signs that Tony does not truly trust Johnny comes from the way he uses other people around him. He builds bonds with guys like Angelo, Rusty, and later even tries to understand Phil, so he is never fully dependent on Johnny as his only bridge to New York. Tony's whole style is to avoid putting his fate in one man's hands. Johnny sees this, and it bothers him. He wants Tony to be loyal to him personally. Instead, Tony treats Johnny like one piece on a larger board. That hurts Johnny's pride, but there is nothing he can do about it without risking open conflict. The strange thing about Tony and Johnny is that, even with all this tension, they do share real moments of understanding. They both know what it is to juggle family and business, to deal with panic attacks or silent stress, to fear losing everything. In quiet scenes, they talk about their wives, their kids, and the old days. In those moments, both men drop their masks a little. You can see that they like each other on some human level. They are close in age, close in rank, and have gone through similar wars in their respective worlds. If they had been in another line of work, they might have been honest friends. But this life does not allow simple friendships between bosses from neighboring territories. Every nice gesture has a hidden meaning. Every favor has a price. Every word is weighed for signs of disrespect. That constant paranoia eats away at whatever real affection might have been there. Tony is always asking himself if Johnny is trying to get over on him. Johnny is always wondering if Tony is plotting behind his back with someone else in New York. This mutual suspicion shapes their choices. When push comes to shove, both men choose their own positions over any personal bond. You can see this clearly when Tony decides how far he is willing to go to help Johnny with his legal troubles. Johnny expects Tony to sacrifice money and stability to show real loyalty. Tony offers some help, but he draws a hard line when it starts to affect his own bottom line. That decision says everything about where Tony really stands. Johnny is not family. He is not a partner in the true sense. He is a business contact whose problems are not Tony's problems unless they spill over into New Jersey. Tony can feel bad for Johnny, can feel sorry for Ginny and the kids, but he does not feel responsible for fixing Johnny's life. From Johnny's side, there is also a limit to his loyalty. When Tony has his own headaches with the FBI, with internal traders, or with wildcards like Ralph and Paulie, Johnny rarely goes out of his way to help him without getting something in return. He may offer advice or lend his name to settle something, but he never puts his own position at real risk for Tony. When Phil later becomes a bigger force in New York, Johnny does not protect Tony as much as he could. He lets Phil build up his own resentments and only tries to calm things down when it is almost too late. Even then, Johnny's effort feels half-hearted, like a man who wants to avoid a disaster, but will not pay the full price to stop it. So did they like each other or hate each other? The answer sits somewhere in the middle. They liked each other as long as their interests lined up. They liked each other as men who understood the same strange world. But they also hated parts of each other. Tony hated Johnny's thin skin, his greed, and his habit of using emotion as a weapon in business. Johnny hated Tony's stubborn independence, his refusal to bow to New York, and his cold way of putting business above all personal feelings. They never fully trusted each other, and in their world, Lack of trust is a quiet form of hatred. Their dynamic is best described as competitive respect. They saw each other as serious men, worthy of a seat at the table. They never dismissed the other as weak or stupid. But that respect came with fear. Each one knew the other had the power to cause a lot of damage if they ever became true enemies. That fear forced them to keep things polite on the surface, even when they were angry inside. It is why they continued to meet, to talk, to share meals, even after their relationship had been damaged many times. Neither of them could afford the cost of turning an uneasy alliance into an open war. One way to really see the truth of their dynamic is to look at the small, almost quiet scenes where they are not arguing over money or blood, but just living regular moments. When Johnny moves to New Jersey and becomes Tony's neighbor for a short time, the situation is almost funny. Here is the powerful New York underboss, forced by circumstances to live in the same kind of quiet suburb that Tony has always used as a shield. For a minute, their worlds overlap in a personal way. There are barbecues, casual talks in the yard, moments where they look less like mob bosses and more like regular middle-aged men dealing with mortgages, family stress, and the fear of change. Tony seems to enjoy having Johnny close, but he also feels the pressure of having New York literally on his doorstep. Johnny, for his part, likes the comfort, but hates the idea that people might think he has been pushed out of his own territory. Even in this peaceful setting, pride and image follow them. Another telling moment comes when Johnny tries to use emotion to pull Tony closer. He opens up about his worries for his daughters, his shame about Ginny's depression and eating, and the weight of being the man everyone looks to. Tony understands this pain more than most. He has his own panic attacks, his own problems with Carmela and the kids, his own fear of being seen as weak. In a different story, these shared pains might have pulled them into a real, lasting friendship. But here, vulnerability gets weaponized. The same details Johnny shares in confidence later become part of how Tony measures him, part of how he decides how far he can trust him. Tony starts to feel that Johnny's emotions are not just honest but also tools he uses to steer people. That thought makes Tony pull back. There is also the way they both handle jokes and disrespect. Tony uses humor to cope and to test people. He makes cracks, pushes buttons, and watches how people react. Johnny, however, reveals through the Ginny situation that he cannot stand being the butt of a joke. For Tony, that stiffness is a weakness. If you cannot take a joke, you are easier to manipulate, easier to set off. For Johnny, Tony's relaxed attitude towards disrespect is its own kind of flaw. He believes a man in their position should crush any sign of mockery. These different views on something as simple as a joke say a lot about why they can never fully line up. They are similar enough to understand each other, but different enough to keep bumping into each other's limits. In the end, their story is a warning about the limits of friendship and organized crime. Tony and Johnny start out with a chance to be real friends. They share laughs, stories, and dreams about running their worlds their own way. But every step up the ladder pushes them further apart. Power creates jealousy. Money creates fights. Pride turns small slights into big insults. By the time Johnny is in jail, and Tony is dealing with Phil and other threats, whatever bond they once had is buried under layers of business, lies, and half-truths. If Tony thinks about Johnny at all in the later stages of the story, it is with a mix of nostalgia and cold judgment. He remembers the good times, the jokes, the early deals, but he also remembers how many problems came from New York, and how often Johnny was at the center of them. Johnny, sitting in prison, probably feels something similar. He remembers Tony as the smart, capable guy from New Jersey who could be a real ally. But he also remembers the times Tony would not bend, the times Tony put his own interests first, the times Tony treated him like just another obstacle. So Tony Soprano and Johnny Sack stand in a place that is not quite friendship and not pure hatred. They are rivals forced into partnership, allies held together by money and geography more than true loyalty. They laugh together but sleep with one eye open. They call each other my friend, while planning for the day the other man might no longer be useful. In a different world, they might have been honest friends. In their world, the best they can manage is polite tension, shared history, and a respect that is always mixed with fear.